The air inside the large rehearsal hall felt heavy and thick, not because of the weather outside, but because of the silence that hung over the room. It was the kind of silence that makes you afraid to breathe too loudly. This was the day that could change everything, and everyone waiting in the long hallway knew it. The walls were painted a plain, off-white color, and the floor was covered in a dull gray carpet that swallowed the sound of footsteps. Sitting near the end of a row of plastic chairs was a young woman named Amy. She wasn't like the others, who were busy stretching their fingers or whispering nervously to each other about scales and arpeggios. Amy sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was staring at a spot on the carpet. She was wearing a dress that looked nice enough, but if you looked closely, you could see the hem was slightly frayed, and the fabric wasn't the expensive silk or fine wool that some of the other candidates were wearing. It was just a simple dress she had bought a year ago for a family gathering. Amy didn't go to a fancy music school. She didn't have a degree from a big conservatory with gold letters on the certificate. She learned to play on an old, slightly out-of-tune piano that sat in the corner of a dusty community center. The piano had sticky keys, and sometimes if you played a chord too hard, the pedals would stick to the floor. But she loved that piano. She spent hours there every day after her shifts at a small bakery, listening to the way the sound bounced off the high ceilings. She learned to feel the music in her bones because she couldn't always trust the She was waiting to play for Maestro Vance. Everyone knew who he was. He was a legend in the classical music world. People said he could hear a single wrong note from a mile away. They said he never smiled, and that his standards were higher than the mountains. He was known for ending auditions after just 10 seconds if he didn't like what he heard. The thought made Amy's stomach turn over, but she took a deep breath to steady herself. She reminded herself why she was doing this. She wasn't doing it for fame. She was doing it because the music was the only thing that made sense to her. Down the hall, a heavy metal door clicked open. A man in a gray suit stepped out holding a clipboard. He didn't look happy. He looked like a man who just wanted to go home. Next, the man called out, his voice echoing in the narrow hallway. "Is there an Amy?" Amy felt her heart jump into her throat. This was it. She stood up, smoothing down the front of her dress with shaky hands. Around her, the other musicians looked up. Some of them looked at her with pity, knowing how hard it was to go in there. Others looked at her with curiosity, probably wondering why someone they hadn't seen at any of the elite universities was auditioning. Amy ignored them. She picked up her bag, which held her sheet music, and walked toward the man. "I'm Amy," she said softly. The man checked his list and nodded, not really looking at her. "Go right in. Don't touch anything except the piano. Good luck." He stepped aside to let her pass. Amy walked through the metal door. The room on the other side was massive. It was a concert hall, empty except for the stage. Rows and rows of red velvet seats stretched out into the darkness, waiting for an audience that wasn't there yet. The stage was brightly lit by spotlights, making the wooden floor shine. In the very center of the light sat the grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, black and shiny, looking like a giant beast waiting to be tamed. It looked perfect. At a long table set up in the center of the seating area, 3 judges sat. But Amy only had eyes for the man in the middle. Maestro Vance? He was older, with silver hair combed back neatly. He was wearing a dark suit, and he sat with his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't look up as Amy walked onto the stage. He just kept looking down at the table in front of him, as if he were bored before she had even played a single note. The 2 other judges, a younger woman with glasses and an older man with a beard, looked up politely. But Vance didn't move. Amy walked up the 3 steps to the stage. Her footsteps sounded loud, like thumping in the quiet room. She reached the piano bench and adjusted it. It squeaked loudly against the floor. The sound made her wince. It was an ugly sound in such a beautiful room. She sat down and placed her sheet music on the rack. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment. They felt cold. She rubbed them together quickly to try and get some warmth into them. The air conditioning was blowing hard from the ceiling vents, making the space feel sterile and cold, completely different from the warm, dusty community center she was used to. She looked out at the judges. Maestro Vance still hadn't looked up. He was writing something on a piece of paper. He seemed to be in his own world. "Name?" Vance asked abruptly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a sharp edge that cut through the room. "Amy, sir," she said, her voice trembling a little. "Peace." "Rachmaninoff, sir." "The second concerto," she replied. Vance stopped writing for a fraction of a second, just a pause, and then he kept going. He didn't say good luck or whenever you were ready, just sat there, radiating impatience. It was clear he had already made up his mind about her. She could feel it coming off him in waves. He was thinking, here's another amateur wasting my time. He expected nothing. He was waiting for a mistake so he could send her away. Amy felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to run. She wanted to stand up, apologize for wasting their time, and run back to the safety of her community center. But she didn't. She remembered the hours she spent practicing until her fingers bled. She remembered the feeling of the music when it was right, when it felt like flying. She owed it to herself to try. She took a deep, shaky breath. She closed her eyes for a split second to clear her mind. She pictured the dusty piano, the smell of old wood, and the sound of the rain on the roof back home. That was where the music lived. Not in this cold, bright room. Amy opened her eyes and placed her fingers on the keys. They were smooth and cool, much different from the worn ivory keys she was used to. She took one more breath, and then she began. The opening chords were meant to be heavy, like the tolling of bells. She struck the keys with all the emotion she had. The sound filled the hall, booming and powerful. For a second, it felt perfect. It felt like the music was finally free. But then it happened. Just a few bars in, her fingers, stiffed from the cold air and the nerves, didn't move quite fast enough. There was a fumble, a jagged, disconnected sound where there should have been a smooth flow. It wasn't a huge crash, but to a trained ear, it was glaring. It was a stumble in the middle of a sprint. Amy's heart stopped. She tried to recover to smooth it over, but the moment was broken. The rhythm faltered. She pushed on, trying to find the thread again, but the mistake had shaken her confidence. The music lost its flow. It became hesitant. The sound of the piano seemed to shrink in the large room. The notes that were supposed to be soaring now sounded small and weak. Amy's fingers felt like sausages, clumsy and slow. She was fighting the instrument, fighting the room, and fighting her own terror. She could hear the wrong notes echoing in her head. Louder than the right ones, she kept playing for a few more seconds, hoping it would get better, hoping she could find the magic again. But it was gone. The connection was severed then. From the darkness of the auditorium, a hand went up. It was Maestro Vance. He didn't even look up. He just raised his hand in a sharp, cutting motion. "Stop," he said. The word wasn't a shout. It was flat, dead. It was the sound of a door slamming shut. Amy's hands froze on the keys. The last note she had played died away slowly, fading into the silence. The room was quiet again, quieter than it had been before. The silence felt heavier now, filled with the weight of her failure. Amy sat there for a moment, her hands still hovering over the keys. She felt hot tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She slowly pulled her hands back into her lap. She looked down at the keys, shiny and black, reflecting her own disappointed face. Vance finally looked up. He didn't look angry. He didn't look annoyed. He just looked indifferent. That was worse than anger. To him, she was just a name on a list that he could now cross off. "Your technique is rough," Vance said. He didn't say it to be mean. He said it like he was stating a fact, like saying the sky was blue. "You don't have the precision for this stage? This is not a place for guessing. We are done here." He lowered his hand and went back to writing on his paper. The dismissal was absolute. There was no room for argument. There was no chance to try again. The verdict had been delivered. Amy felt a small crack form in her chest. It wasn't a sharp pain, just a dull, aching emptiness. She knew he was right, in a way. She wasn't as polished as the others. She didn't have the training. She had taken a gamble, and she had lost. She stood up slowly from the bench. Her legs felt weak, like jelly. She closed her folder of music, the snap of the cover sounding loud in the quiet room. She wanted to say something, maybe to apologize or to explain, but her voice was gone. She had no words left. She turned away from the piano, away from the bright lights, and toward the dark edge of the stage. The walk to the stairs felt like the longest walk of her life. With each step, she felt the dream slipping further away. The bakery, the community center, the quiet life, that was where she belonged. This world of spotlights and grand pianos was not for her. As she reached the stairs to descend into the darkness of the audience area, she hesitated. She looked back one last time at the gleaming instrument. It was so beautiful. It was so perfect, and she had just proven she wasn't good enough for it. She gripped the handle of her bag tighter and turned away, stepping down into the shadows, ready to disappear and never look back. The walk from the stage to the side exit was only a few yards. But to Amy, it felt like walking across a wide desert without any water. Every step was heavy. Her shoes, which she had polished so carefully that morning, made soft scuffing sounds on the wooden floor. In the huge, empty hall, those little sounds seemed to scream out her failure. She kept her head down, looking at the floor, afraid to lift her gaze and see the disappointment on the faces of the judges. Maestro Vance was already writing again. The scratch of his pen on the paper was the only sound in the room. It was a dry, scratchy noise that felt like an insect buzzing in her ear. He didn't watch her go. He didn't care. To him, she was just a mistake that had been corrected, a smudge on a clean glass that had been wiped away. The other two judges didn't look at her either. They were busy shuffling papers or checking their watches, looking bored. Amy felt invisible, but not in a good way. She felt like a ghost that nobody wanted to see. She reached the heavy red curtain that marked the edge of the stage area. This was the boundary. Behind the curtain was the real world, the world where she was just a baker who liked music. In front of the curtain was the world she had tried to join, the world of the masters. She paused for just a second, her hand resting on the rough fabric of the curtain. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it thumping against her ribs. It wasn't just the rejection that hurt. It was the feeling that she hadn't been given a fair chance. She knew she had stumbled. She knew the mistake was bad. But did that one mistake erase all the years of work? Did it erase the feeling she put into the music? A tear finally escaped from her eye and rolled down her cheek. It was hot and fast. She wiped it away quickly with the back of her hand, angry at herself for crying. She didn't want them to see her cry, even if they weren't looking. She took a shaky breath and stepped behind the curtain. The backstage area was dim and narrow. It smelled of dust and old ropes. There were crates and cables scattered all over the floor. It was messy and chaotic, completely different from the perfect order of the stage. Amy leaned against a concrete wall. She needed a moment to just breathe. The air back here was stale, but it felt safer than the air out there. She felt a strong urge to just run. She wanted to run out of the building, run to the bus stop, and go home. She wanted to put on her apron and knead bread dough. Dough never judged her. Dough didn't care if her fingers slipped. It just needed to be worked. She looked down at the music folder in her hand. The corners were curled. She had spent so many hours marking the notes, highlighting the dynamics, writing little reminders to herself in the margins. All of that effort seemed useless now. It was just a stack of paper. She felt foolish for thinking she could compete with the students from the big universities. They had practiced on beautiful pianos their whole lives. They had teachers who had played in the greatest halls in the world. Amy had taught herself on a broken piano. Maybe Maestro Vance was right. Maybe she didn't have the precision, but deep down in a quiet corner of her heart, a little voice spoke up. "But you have the feeling," the voice said. "You know what the music is saying?" Amy pushed the thought away. It didn't matter what the music said if she couldn't play the notes correctly. The feeling wasn't enough. She closed her eyes and saw the piano sitting alone on the stage. It looked so lonely under the spotlight. It was a tool, waiting for someone to use it. She had failed the tool. She had failed the music. She pushed herself off the wall. She had to get out of here. She had to leave before someone came out and asked her to leave, or worse, offered her a look of pity. She started walking toward the back exit door. The hallway was long and dark. Her footsteps echoed. She was almost at the door. Her hand was reaching for the handle to push it open, step out into the sunlight. But then she stopped. She stopped because she couldn't bear to leave it like this. She couldn't bear to let the last sound she made in that hall be a mistake. It felt wrong. It felt like leaving a dirty plate on the table after a meal. It felt unfinished. Her body seemed to turn of its own accord. She wasn't thinking about the judges or the audition anymore. She was thinking about the song, the Rachmaninoff piece she was playing. The second concerto was famous for being difficult, but it was also famous for being incredibly emotional. It wasn't just about fast fingers. It was about longing, about reaching for something you can't quite touch. The very end of the piece was quiet, a series of soft, slow chords that fade away into silence. It was the most important part. It was the answer to all the noise that came before it. Amy realized she hadn't played the ending. She had been cut off right in the middle. The story wasn't finished, and she couldn't walk out that exit door without finishing the story. It wasn't about passing the audition anymore. It was about respect for the music. She owed it to the composer, and she owed it to herself. To play the ending the way she heard it in her head. She turned around and walked back toward the stage. She wasn't walking like a nervous student anymore. She was walking with purpose. She moved quietly, staying in the shadows. She peeked out from the side of the curtain. The stage was still empty. Maestro Vance was still writing. The other judges were looking at their phones. The light on the piano was still shining. It looked like a beacon. Amy took a deep breath. She knew this was risky. She knew she might get in trouble. She wasn't supposed to be on the stage anymore. But she didn't care about the rules. She just needed to play the ending. She stepped out from the curtain. She didn't walk to the center of the stage where the bench was. She didn't need to sit down. The ending didn't require complex hand movements. It was just chords. Big, full, resonant chords. She walked quietly across the floor, hugging the shadows until she was right next to the piano. The piano was huge. Up close, it smelled of varnish and polish. It was beautiful. Amy reached out a hand and touched the smooth wood inside. It was cool to the touch. She closed her eyes for a second and imagined the last few bars. She pictured the notes floating in the air, dissolving like sugar in water. She stepped around to the keyboard. She stood there next to the bench, not sitting. Maestro Vance was about 20 feet away, facing the other direction. He had no idea she was there. Amy placed her right hand on the keys. She didn't place her left hand. The ending she wanted to play was simple. She didn't count off. She didn't prepare. She just struck the chord. It was the final chord of the piece, but she played it differently than usual. She didn't play it softly. She played it with a deep, rich weight. She leaned into the keys, putting her shoulder into it. She wanted the sound to fill every corner of the hall. The sound exploded from the piano. It wasn't loud in an aggressive way. It was loud in a majestic way. It was a sound that demanded attention. At the exact same moment, she pressed down on the sustain pedal with her foot. This was the trick. The key to a piano isn't just hitting the string. It's how you let the sound stop. By holding the pedal down, the dampers lifted off the strings, allowing them to vibrate freely. Amy held the chord. She didn't lift her fingers immediately. She let the pressure transfer from her fingers to the piano. She felt the wood humming against her palms. The sound was rich and complex, with hundreds of overtones mixing together. It was a sound that seemed to have a color, a deep golden purple. Then she slowly, very slowly, lifted her fingers off the keys. The physical noise of the hammers hitting the strings stopped instantly. But the sound didn't stop. The strings continued to vibrate, singing on their own. The sound filled the huge hall. It seemed to grow larger, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling. It was a beautiful, haunting echo. Maestro Vance's pen stopped moving. He froze. His head jerked up slightly. Amy didn't look at him. She was listening. She was listening to how the sound decayed. It wasn't a straight line. It dipped and swelled. The bass notes lasted longer, humming like a cello, while the higher notes sparkled and faded like stars. It was the most perfect silence she had ever heard. It was a living silence. She stood there, her hands hanging by her sides, just listening to the piano finish the sentence she had started. There was no technique here, no fast fingers. There was just sound. Pure, honest sound. The vibrations seemed to hang in the air for a long time, refusing to die. For a moment, the air in the hall felt charged. The atmosphere had completely changed. The cold, professional judgment that had filled the room earlier was gone. In its place was something else, something raw and real. The sound finally began to fade into nothingness. The last of the vibrations whispered away into the rafters. Amy looked at the piano one last time. She felt a sense of peace. She hadn't played perfectly, but she had played truly. The music had been heard. She turned to walk away again. This time she didn't feel like running. She didn't feel like crying. She felt light. She stepped back into the shadows, moving toward the exit. She thought that was it. She thought she would just leave and that would be the end of her story. She didn't know that the sound she left behind was still working its magic on the people in the room. She didn't know that the master was listening to the silence in a way he hadn't listened in years. She just kept walking, her eyes on the dark exit door, ready to step back into her ordinary life. The sound of the chord didn't just fade away. It seemed to soak into the walls of the concert hall. Usually when a note stops, the silence that follows is empty. It is just a lack of noise. But this time the silence felt heavy. It felt like the air was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. Amy stood in the shadows near the side of the stage, her hands hanging loosely by her sides. She wasn't looking at the judges anymore. She was just looking at the floor, listening to the very end of the vibration as it dissolved into the darkness above her head. She felt different now. A minute ago, she had felt small and embarrassed, like a child who had been scolded. But playing that final chord, even though she wasn't supposed to, had given her back a little bit of her dignity. She had played it the way she felt it, not the way the sheet music strictly demanded. She had treated the piano like a friend rather than a test. She had spoken to the instrument, and for a few seconds, the instrument had spoken back. It was a goodbye, but it was a goodbye on her own terms. She didn't have to leave with her head down in shame. She could leave knowing that she had made a sound that was real. Amy took a soft step backward. The hard sole of her shoe didn't make a sound on the carpet that ran along the edge of the stage. She was ready to go. The urge to run had come back, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was just the desire to be outside, to breathe fresh air, to be away from the pressure of this room. She felt emotionally exhausted, like she had just run a marathon. Her chest felt tight, but her mind was clear. She turned her body toward the heavy blackout curtain that led to the backstage hallway. She just needed to walk through that curtain, walk down the long hall, and push the exit bar. She could be on the street in 2 minutes. She could catch the bus, go home, and maybe make some cookies. Baking always calmed her down. The routine of measuring flour and sugar, the smell of butter and vanilla was simple. It made sense. Music was beautiful, but it was complicated and painful. Baking was just chemistry. If you followed the recipe, you got a cake. There was no judge in a gray suit telling you your cake was rough. But she couldn't move yet. Something held her there, invisible and heavy. It was Maestro Vance, on her way out. Amy couldn't help but glance back toward the judge's table. She expected to see him writing furiously, maybe annoyed that she had made a noise after he told her to stop. She expected him to be shuffling papers, getting ready for the next person. But that isn't what she saw. Maestro Vance was frozen. His pen was hovering just above his clipboard, but the tip wasn't touching the paper. He wasn't writing. He wasn't even blinking. He was staring straight ahead, looking at the empty piano bench. His posture had changed. Before, he had been slumped back in his chair, looking bored and dismissive. Now, he was leaning forward, almost like he was trying to hear a whisper from across the room. The icy look in his eyes was gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like confusion. Or maybe it was wonder. Amy watched him from the darkness. She held her own breath. She didn't understand why he wasn't moving. It was just a chord. It was just a final note. Why did it matter so much? The other two judges were looking at him. The woman with the glasses leaned over and whispered something to him, perhaps asking if he was okay. Vance didn't answer her. He just lifted a hand slightly, telling her to be quiet without saying a word. He was listening. He was listening to the silence that the chord had left behind. This was the strange thing about music. Anyone can play a loud noise. But not everyone can make a loud noise that keeps ringing in your ears after the strings have stopped vibrating, the way Amy had struck the keys. Using the weight of her arm and holding the sustained pedal down had created a complex mix of sounds. The bass notes were deep and rumbled like thunder in the distance, while the high notes shimmered like sunlight on water. The piano was still singing to him, even though Amy was no longer touching it. Vance slowly stood up. This was very unusual. He never stood up between auditions. He considered it undignified. He believed the master should sit on the throne and let the performers come to him. But now, he was on his feet. He walked out from behind the long table and stepped into the center aisle. The carpet there muffled his footsteps. Amy pressed her back flat against the wall behind the curtain. She felt a sudden spike of panic. Was he coming to yell at her? Was he angry that she had played out of turn? Was security going to come? She shrunk back into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs again. She wasn't ready to be scolded. She just wanted to disappear. The maestro walked slowly up the aisle toward the stage. He stopped about halfway, maybe 10 rows back. He didn't look at the exit doors where Amy was hiding. He looked only at the piano. He was thinking about the sound he had just heard. In his 40 years of teaching, he had heard thousands of students play Rachmaninoff. He heard them play fast. He heard them play loud. He heard them play with technical perfection, hitting every note like a machine. He heard them play with their brains, showing off how much they practiced, but almost none of them played with their soul. Most young players were terrified of the silence. They thought the music was only about the notes they hit. They rushed to the next note, afraid that if they stopped, the audience would get bored. They filled every second with noise. But this girl, she had done the opposite. She had played the sound, and then she had let the sound live. She wasn't afraid of the silence. She trusted the piano to do the work. She understood that the music happens in the space between the notes, just as much as it happens in the notes themselves, the way the chord had decayed, how the treble faded quickly while the bass lingered, showed a sophisticated understanding of acoustics. It wasn't luck. It was a choice. A beautiful, artistic choice. And it was a choice that came from a place of deep emotion, not from a textbook. Vance rubbed his chin, his brow furrowed. He realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had dismissed her because her technique wasn't polished. He had been looking at the dirt under her fingernails instead of the gold she was holding. He had heard a stumble in the fingers and missed the song in the heart. He judged her by the standards of a machine, not the standards of an artist. And now, hearing that final fading echo, he realized the depth of his error. The roughness he heard wasn't a lack of skill. It was the sound of someone pouring their whole life into the keys, risking everything for the music. The silence in the hall was absolute now. The last vibrations of the strings were gone. The air had settled. Vance stood there alone in the aisle, the empty stage lit up in front of him. The piano sat there like a sleeping animal. The girl was gone. He thought she had left. "Wait," he whispered. The word was so quiet that Amy almost didn't hear it. But she did hear it. It wasn't an angry shout. It sounded like a plea. Amy stood very still behind the curtain. Her hand was resting on the rough fabric. Her legs were trembling slightly. She was torn. The sensible part of her brain said, "Asterisk go. Walk away. Keep your dignity. You already said goodbye, asterisk." If she walked out now, she would leave with a secret victory. She would know that she had stunned the great Maestro Vance, even if he never admitted it. She could go back to her bakery and live her life knowing she was good enough. But the other part of her, the part that loved the music, couldn't move. That part was curious. Why did he say wait? What did he hear in that chord that changed everything? She peeked around the edge of the curtain again. Vance was looking around the hall now, turning in a slow circle. He looked confused. He seemed to be looking for the source of the sound, checking to see if there was a speaker system or some trick. But there was nothing. Just the piano. Just the memory of the girl in the simple dress. He looked at the spot on the stage where Amy had stood. He looked at the bench, which was slightly crooked from where she had sat. He looked at the sheet music still sitting on the rack. Fluttering slightly in the draft from the air vents, Amy watched his face. She saw the transformation. The arrogance was melting away, leaving a look of profound respect. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Or perhaps a man who had just remembered something beautiful he had forgotten long ago. I wasn't listening, Vance murmured to himself, shaking his head slowly. He sounded sad. I was listening to the notes. But she was playing the silence. Amy felt a shiver run down her spine. He understood. He actually understood. That was the thing she had always wanted, more than anything. She didn't want to be famous. She wanted to be understood. The exit door was right there. The handle was metal and cold, waiting for her hand. But she couldn't push it. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She stepped out from the shadow of the curtain, just enough so that she could be seen if he looked toward the side of the stage. She didn't walk forward. She just waited. Vance turned back toward the stage, his eyes sweeping the light. Then he stopped. He saw a movement in the shadows. He saw the hem of her dress. He saw her face pale and watching him. Their eyes met across the distance. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt electric. The doubt that had filled the room, her doubt about herself, and his doubt about her, was gone. It had vanished with the last vibration of that chord. In its place was a connection. It was silent. It was louder than any applause. The distance between the edge of the stage and the center aisle wasn't very far, maybe 15 feet. But to Amy, it felt like a massive canyon had opened up. She stood just outside the bright circle of the spotlight, half hidden in the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains. Her heart was beating so hard that she could feel a pulse in her ears, a rhythmic thumping that drowned out the quiet hum of the building's air conditioning. She had her hand gripping the thick fabric of the curtain, her knuckles turning white. She was ready to pull it back across her face and vanish. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. Go now, her mind said. Asterisk. He's just looking at the piano. He doesn't want you. Asterisk, but she couldn't move her feet. They felt like they were glued to the floor. Maestro Vance stood in the aisle, looking smaller than he had just a few minutes ago. He wasn't the towering giant of judgment anymore. He looked like a man who had seen something he wasn't expecting to see. He was looking straight at the shadows where she was standing. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were wide. There was a softness in his face that Amy had never seen in any photo of him. He looked confused, but it wasn't the confusion of someone who is lost. It was the confusion of someone who has found a treasure they didn't know was buried there. He took a slow step forward. The carpet muffled the sound of his shoe. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't bark an order. He just stood there, looking at her, with his head tilted slightly to one side. It was the same look a person gives a painting when they are trying to figure out why it makes them feel something. You, he said. The word was soft, barely a whisper. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't an accusation. Amy didn't know what to do. Should she answer? Should she bow? Should she apologize? She felt a lump in her throat that made it hard to swallow. She just stood there, clutching her music bag to her chest like it was a shield. You're still here, Vance said. It was a statement of fact, not a question. He took another step closer to the stage. I thought you left. I thought you were gone. I was leaving, Amy whispered back. Her voice was shaky and thin. It sounded so small in the big room. I just wanted to finish the song. Vance let out a long breath. He looked down at his hands for a second, then back up at her. The arrogance that usually surrounded him like a suit of armor was completely gone. He looked vulnerable. I dismissed you, he said. He said it plainly like he was confessing a crime. I told you to stop. I told you that your technique was rough. Amy nodded slightly. She remembered the sting of those words. They had felt like a physical blow. Yes, sir. You did. I was wrong, Vance said. The silence that followed these words was heavier than the silence after the chord. Amy wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. The great maestro Vance, the man who was never wrong, had just admitted he was mistaken. He walked up the few steps onto the stage, but he stayed a respectful distance away from her. He didn't want to crowd her. He looked like a man approaching a wild bird, afraid that if he moved too fast it would fly away. I was listening to your fingers, he explained, gesturing vaguely with one hand. I was listening for the speed. I was listening for the perfection. That is what I do. That is my job. I listen for mistakes. And when you stumbled, I stopped listening. I heard the mistake, and I missed the music. He paused and looked at the piano. He walked over to it and rested his hand gently on the sleek black lid. But that chord, he closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the sound. That last chord you played, it wasn't rough. It was honest. It had a color to it that I haven't heard in years. The way you let it sustain. The way you let the silence live. That is not something you can teach in a school. That is not something you can learn from a book. That comes from somewhere else. Amy felt a strange warmth spreading through her chest. The shame that had been burning her began to cool down. She looked at the maestro. She realized that he wasn't judging her anymore. He was seeing her. He was seeing the girl who spent hours in a dusty community center, playing a broken piano because she loved the sound. He was seeing the person, not the student. I don't have perfect fingers, Amy said, finding her voice a little stronger now. I can't play as fast as the others. I mess up the transitions sometimes. Vance shook his head firmly. I don't care about the transitions right now, he said. Any monkey can be trained to play fast notes. I have 50 students out there who can play those notes perfectly. They play like typewriters. Click, click, click. It is impressive, but it is empty. He took another step toward her. The light from the spotlight caught his face. He looked older now, tired but happy. When you played that final note, you didn't play it to show off, Vance said. You played it because you had to. You were having a conversation with the instrument. And for the first time in a long time, I actually wanted to hear what the piano had to say back. He turned his back to her and walked to the center of the stage. He picked up the clipboard he had left on the chair. He looked at the paper where he had scribbled no next to her name. He took his pen and crossed it out. The scratch of the pen was loud in the quiet hall. Then he did something that shocked Amy. He didn't just invite her back to the piano to finish the audition. He walked to the side of the stage where the spare benches were. He picked up a simple wooden stool and placed it right next to the piano bench. He sat down on the stool. He wasn't sitting behind the table like a judge anymore. He was sitting on the stage, like a student or a friend. Amy, he said, please, put your bag down. Amy hesitated. She looked at the exit door one last time. It was right there. The safe choice was to leave. The easy choice was to go back to her normal life. But she looked at the maestro sitting on the little stool. He wasn't looking at his watch. He wasn't looking at his paperwork. He was looking at her with eyes full of hope. She slowly uncurled her fingers from the curtain. She walked out of the shadows and into the light. It was warm on her skin. She placed her music bag on the floor near the piano. Vance smiled. It was a small, crooked smile, but it was genuine. I don't want you to play the Rachmaninoff again, he said. We don't need to test your fingers anymore. I know what they can do, and I know what they can't do. Then what do you want me to play? Amy asked. I want you to play something else, Vance said. Play something that makes you feel the way that chord felt. Play something that makes you close your eyes. Play something real. I don't care if you miss notes. I don't care if it takes you 10 minutes to find the right key. Just play. Amy sat down on the bench. It felt the same as before, but everything else was different. The heavy pressure was gone. The fear of the master was gone. There was just her and the piano and an old man who wanted to listen. She thought for a moment. She didn't reach for the sheet music she had brought. She left the Rachmaninoff on the rack. She closed the folder. She thought about a melody she used to play at the community center on rainy days. It was a simple folk song. Nothing fancy. But it was beautiful. She placed her hands on the keys. She took a deep breath. She wasn't nervous now. She felt like she was telling a secret to a friend. She began to play. It was simple. It was slow. The melody floated out into the hall, clear and sweet. And this time, when her fingers moved, they didn't stumble. They moved with a confidence she hadn't felt before. It wasn't because her technique had suddenly improved. It was because she wasn't thinking about her hands. She was thinking about the music. She was thinking about the story the notes were telling. Vance sat on his stool, listening. He didn't write anything down. He didn't check his watch. He just closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. The doubt that had filled the room was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and discovery. He knew he had found something rare. Not a perfect technician, but a true musician. The simple folk song drifted through the large hall, winding its way around the empty velvet seats like a gentle river. Amy played with a soft touch, her fingers moving over the white and black keys, with a kind of tenderness that usually only mothers have when holding a sleeping baby. It was not a loud song. It did not have crashing chords or fast runs that made your heart race. Instead, it had a melody that felt like a memory, something sad but sweet, like looking at an old photograph of a place you used to love. Because she wasn't thinking about making mistakes, Amy didn't make any. Her hands felt loose and warm. The stiffness from the cold air and the fear had completely melted away. She was no longer trying to prove she was good enough for Maestro Vance. She was just playing. She was playing for herself, and she was playing for the music. Her eyes were half closed, and she swayed slightly with the rhythm, feeling the pulse of the song in her chest. Maestro Vance sat on the small wooden stool, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He had completely forgotten about the clipboard on the floor. He had forgotten about the other two judges who were sitting silently at their table with their mouths slightly open. Vance watched Amy's hands, but he was also watching her face. He saw the peace there. He saw that when she played, she wasn't in this rehearsal hall anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere beautiful. For the first time in many years, Vance felt like a student again. Usually, when he listened to auditions, his brain was busy listing errors. Left hand late, he would think. Dynamics too weak. Pedal too muddy. But now, his brain was quiet. He wasn't analyzing the music. He was just bathing in it. He realized that this was the feeling he had been chasing his entire life. The feeling of being completely transported by a sound. He had spent decades trying to manufacture it with technique and perfection. But here was a girl with rough technique, creating it effortlessly with honesty. The song slowly came to an end. Amy played the final few notes, high and soft, like dust motes, catching the sun in a quiet room. She let the last note fade, just like she had done before, holding her breath until the sound was completely gone. When she lifted her hands off the keys, the silence that followed was not heavy or scary. It was peaceful. It was the kind of silence you get after a good rain. When the world feels washed clean, Amy sat there for a moment, her hands resting in her lap. She slowly opened her eyes and looked around. The bright lights of the stage made her blink. She remembered where she was. She turned her head to look at Maestro Vance. She expected him to look critical. She expected him to say, "That was nice, but too simple." That was what the teachers at the community center used to say. They always wanted her to play things that were harder and faster. But Vance was smiling. It wasn't the polite fake smile he gave to donors. It was a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He looked like a man who had just found water after walking in a desert for days. "Amy," he said softly. His voice sounded different too. It sounded kind. That was beautiful. Amy blushed a little and looked down at her hands. "It's just a folk song," she whispered. "It's not real repertoire." Vance shook his head vigorously. "No," he said firmly. "That was the most real thing I have heard in this hall in 10 years. That was music." He stood up from his stool and walked over to her. He didn't tower over her. He stood next to the piano, looking at the keys with a new respect. Do you know why I sent you away earlier? He asked. Amy nodded. Because I messed up. Because I'm not good enough. Because I was blind, Vance corrected her. He looked at her seriously. I was listening for the mechanics. I was listening for how fast your fingers could move. I was judging you like you were a machine, checking to see if all the parts were working correctly. But music is not a machine, Amy. Music is a human language, and you speak it fluently. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. It was a simple white card with black writing. But it wasn't just a card. It was a key to a different world. I run a masterclass here, Vance said, placing the card on the piano next to her sheet music. Only the best students in the country get in. Usually I require them to play 3 perfect etudes just to get an audition. Amy looked at the card. Her name wasn't on it. It just had his name and a phone number. She didn't understand what he was doing. Your fingers will catch up to your heart, Vance continued, guessing what she was thinking. Your technique is rough because you taught yourself on bad instruments. But that is easy to fix. I can teach you how to smooth out the rough edges. I can teach you the scales. I can teach you the pedaling. He paused, looking her right in the eyes. But I cannot teach someone how to play with soul. I cannot teach them how to make the silence sing. You already have that. That is a gift. And it is a rare one. Amy felt tears pricking her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of shock and relief. Are you? Are you asking me to be your student? She asked, her voice trembling. Yes, Vance said. I am asking you to come and study with me. Not to learn how to play like a robot, but to learn how to use your gift properly. The world needs to hear this. The world needs to hear the way you play. Amy looked at the card, then at the maestro, then back at the piano. The doubt that had haunted her for her entire life, the voice that said she wasn't good enough, that she was just a baker from a small town vanished. It didn't fade away slowly. It vanished instantly, like a shadow when a bright light is turned on. She realized that her imperfections were not flaws to be ashamed of. They were what made her music real. They were what made it human. She reached out and took the card. It felt heavy in her hand, like it was made of gold. I would like that, Amy said. A smile broke across her face, a bright, genuine smile that lit up the whole stage. Good, Vance said. He nodded, satisfied. He looked back at the 2 judges at the table who seemed completely confused by what was happening, but were clapping anyway. He waved his hand at them dismissively as if they didn't matter. They didn't. The only thing that mattered was the music. Practice time starts at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Vance said to Amy. Don't be late, and bring that folk music with you. I want to know where that song comes from. I won't be late, Amy promised. She gathered her things, placing the worn folder into her bag. She picked up the business card and held it tight. She stood up, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to apologize for taking up space. She walked toward the stage steps. Vance didn't turn away. He watched her go with a look of deep respect. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped and looked back one last time. The maestro was still standing there by the piano, his hand resting on the glossy black wood. The room still smelled of rosin and old velvet, but it didn't smell cold anymore. It smelled like possibility. Amy walked down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing on the carpet. She walked past the judges who had ignored her. She walked past the empty seats. She reached the metal door at the back of the hall. She pushed the handle. The heavy door swung open easily. Bright, warm sunlight flooded in, blinding her for a moment. She stepped out of the cool, dark hall and into the bustling city street. The noise of traffic and people hit, herkers honking, sirens wailing, people talking on their phones. It was chaotic and loud, but to Amy it sounded like a symphony. It all had rhythm. It all had life. She took a deep breath of the fresh air. She held the business card up to the sun, looking at the name printed there. Maestro Vance. Just 20 minutes ago, she had been a failure. She had been dismissed. She had been invisible. Now she was a student of the most famous pianist in the world. But more importantly, she believed in herself. She knew that she didn't need to be perfect to be great. She just needed to be true. She put the card safely into her pocket, right next to her heart. She tightened the strap of her bag on her shoulder and started walking toward the bus stop. She didn't walk with her head down anymore. She walked with her head up, her eyes bright, looking forward to whatever came next. She knew the road would be hard. She knew there would be long hours of practice and difficult lessons ahead. But she also knew that she had something to say. And finally, she had someone who wanted to listen.